There are stories whispered through generations, tales that slip through time like smoke through old wooden cracks, stories the soil itself seems to remember long after the people are gone. Among them is one that begins in the deep south, where the air was thick with heat and history, and where silence was often louder than any sound. It begins on a stretch of land known as the Whitmore plantation, a place both envied and feared, where wealth and cruelty lived side by side. The field stretched endlessly beneath a sky too bright for the pain it overlooked. Cotton swayed like ghosts in the wind, tended by hands that would never touch freedom. The master of this land, Charles Whitmore, was a man who believed his power divine. To him, the world was ordered, each life given its place and purpose. His name meant respect in town and obedience at home. Yet, behind those polished floors and ivory pillars, something quiet and irreversible had already begun. Evelyn Whitmore was his wife. To those who saw her at Sunday service, she was the perfect image of grace and obedience, a woman raised to be silent and adorned. But inside, she carried a hollowness that no prayer could fill. Years of isolation had carved out something cold in her heart, something that waited for warmth in a world that offered none. Her days were marked by routine, the pouring of tea, the reading of letters, the endless pretending. She smiled when expected and spoke only when spoken to. But in the evenings, when the candles burned low and the house grew still, she would stand by the window and look out toward the fields. There, under the fading sun, she often saw him, a man who should have been invisible to her, and yet, she could not look away. His name was Samuel. No one knew his age, for time on the plantation did not belong to men like him. He worked the land with a quiet precision, his movements steady, his gaze unwavering. To the others, he was just another worker, another body beneath the heat. But to Evelyn, there was something in him that broke the stillness of her world. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried a calm she had never known. There was a depth in his silence that seemed to see her, truly see her, in a way her husband never had. Theirs was not a story of passion or impulse. It was born out of loneliness, a kind of quiet desperation that grows in the corners of forgotten hearts. No one knew when the first glance became something more. No one heard the soft exchanges in passing, or the nights when footsteps crossed lines that should have remained uncrossed. What happened between them was not spoken of, not even to themselves. It lived in stolen moments, in the soft hum of crickets outside her window, in the way her heart would race at the sound of his name. Months passed, and the world outside remained unchanged, but within the walls of the Whitmore estate, time began to move differently. Evelyn felt it first, the weight beneath her ribs, the slow flutter that grew stronger with each passing week. At first, she told herself it was nothing, perhaps nerves, perhaps hope. But as the days stretched on, denial could no longer protect her. She was with child. It should have been a blessing, the kind that restored joy to a house like this. For years, Whitmore had prayed for an heir, someone to carry his name, his pride, his legacy. The news should have filled their home with laughter. Instead, it filled it with something else, fear. Evelyn knew what the world would see when that child arrived. She knew what the skin would reveal, what the eyes would betray. And she knew that when the truth came to light, it would not destroy only her. It would destroy everyone bound to her secret. In the months that followed, she grew quieter, her movements more careful. She avoided her husband's touch, his questions, his gaze. Whitmore, too proud to notice the distance, told himself she was simply protecting their unborn child. He spoke of the future with renewed vigor, spoke of expansion, of inheritance, of glory. But his words meant nothing to her now. Each time he spoke of the Whitmore name, it felt like a curse. The plantation continued as it always had, cotton in the fields, chains in the shadows, songs carried faintly through the night. Yet, beneath that rhythm, something was unraveling. Those who worked closest to the house began to sense it first. The mistress's eyes lingered too long when Samuel passed. The air between them held something unspoken. The whispers began softly, then spread like wind through dry grass. Servants traded glances. No one dared to speak the truth aloud, but everyone knew it when they saw her face. By the time the first leaves began to fall, Evelyn could no longer hide what was coming. Her steps grew slower, her nights restless. The doctor was called, and the news confirmed. The master's wife was expecting. The house erupted with celebration. Bells rang, tables were set, and prayers were offered for a healthy child. Whitmore's pride returned in full. He would finally have the son he'd long been promised. But not every heart on that land shared his joy. There were eyes that refused to meet his, and one in particular that could not look at all. Samuel kept to the fields longer than before, working until the sky turned black. When he returned to his quarters, he sat alone, saying nothing, his mind elsewhere. The sound of her name was enough to twist his breath. He had lived his life knowing what could never be his. Now he lived knowing what he could never undo. Evelyn spent her nights listening to the wind against the shutters, her hands trembling as she traced the outline of her belly. Each heartbeat within her was a reminder, of a choice, of a secret, of a truth too dangerous to speak. The walls of her home began to feel smaller, the air heavier. She had nowhere left to run. And then, one quiet morning, as the master spoke at the dining table about crops and markets, she felt the room tilt beneath her. Her vision blurred. The porcelain teacup slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. The laughter stopped. The master's voice broke mid-sentence. She reached for something to hold on to, but the world went black before she could find it. When she opened her eyes again, the doctor's carriage stood outside, and the whisper of celebration filled the halls. The mistress was with the child. By sunset, the entire plantation knew. The master's joy was boundless. He called it a miracle, a gift from God himself. But not every heart celebrated. Somewhere, deep within those fields, one man's hands stilled mid-work, and his breath caught in his chest. He looked toward the house, his face empty, his soul heavy with the truth he could never speak. And from that moment on, the Whitmore plantation was no longer what it had been. Something unseen had taken root in the soil, something that would not be silenced. Time would pass, seasons would change, but the secret that began in that house would outlive them all. The nights grew longer after the news spread, and the sound of whispers filled the quarters long after the lamps went out. No one dared to speak too loudly, but in the quiet between breaths, the truth passed from mouth to mouth. They said the mistress carried the wrong man's child. They said it softly, with fear in their voices, knowing that if such a rumor reached the master's ears, blood would follow. Yet once a secret begins to move, it cannot be stopped. It lingers in the air, clings to the walls, and changes the way people look at one another. Evelyn felt the change before she heard it. The servants no longer met her eyes. The midwife's hands trembled when she touched her. Even the air seemed different, as if the house itself had begun to breathe in suspicion. She spent most days in her room, curtains drawn, avoiding sunlight and conversation alike. When she walked through the halls, she could feel the weight of unseen eyes following her. Her husband's voice reached her less often now, but when it did, it carried a tone that was not quite love and not yet anger. He spoke to her gently, as though afraid she might break, but beneath that gentleness lived a question he dared not ask. Samuel worked as he always had, but the rhythm of his labor had changed. His silence was no longer just obedience, it was defense. Each time he approached the house, he kept his head low, his eyes fixed on the ground. He tried to stay away, to erase himself from her world, but the distance only deepened what already bound them. When they crossed paths by chance, a turn in the path, a glance through the window, the air between them grew still. Evelyn would look away too quickly, and Samuel would pretend he had not seen her. It was a fragile balance, and each day it felt closer to breaking. Whitmore's pride grew heavier with each passing week. He spoke often of the child, calling it his blood, his future, the one who would inherit all he had built. The house became a stage for his satisfaction. He invited guests to dine, his laughter echoing against the walls. Evelyn sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her smile carefully shaped to match his joy. She laughed when expected, nodded at the right words, but inside, she could feel the walls closing in. Every toast to the unborn heir felt like a blade pressed gently against her throat. At night, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Whitmore would rest his hand on her shoulder and speak of destiny. He would talk of their legacy, of how the child would bear his name and carry his strength. Evelyn would listen, her heart pounding in her chest, praying he could not hear it. She wondered if he saw what she saw when he looked at her. The quiet guilt that lived just behind her eyes. She wondered if he ever noticed how her breath caught each time Samuel's name was mentioned, even in passing. One evening, the sky darkened early, the wind rising with the promise of rain. The storm came without warning, a sudden rush of thunder that rattled the windows and drowned the sounds of the fields. Dinner was served later than usual, and the candles flickered as the wind pressed against the shutters. The table was long and heavy with food, but no one seemed hungry. Whitmore sat at the head, his voice loud over the storm. He spoke of his child again, calling it a blessing, a sign of fortune, a reason to celebrate. The guests laughed and nodded, their faces lit by lightning that flashed through the glass. Evelyn sat beside him, her posture perfect, her face calm. But beneath the table, her hands trembled. Each time the thunder rolled, she flinched, and each time Whitmore praised the child, her chest tightened. Across the room, Samuel stood among the servants, silent, still, his eyes lowered. The flicker of light caught his face for only a moment, but it was enough. Their eyes met, brief, fleeting, dangerous. She turned away at once, her throat dry. The storm outside grew louder, and for a moment, it seemed as if the heavens themselves demanded truth. Whitmore raised his glass. He called for a toast to the future, to the blood of Whitmore that would live on. The room lifted their glasses, voices rising in forced joy. Evelyn's lips moved, but no sound came. She smiled, a thin, trembling smile that did not reach her eyes. The lightning flared again, and for a heartbeat, her reflection in the silverware looked like someone she no longer recognized. When the dinner ended, Whitmore remained by the fire, boasting to his guests. Evelyn excused herself, her steps unsteady as she climbed the stairs. In her room, the noise from below faded, replaced by the rhythm of rain against glass. She pressed her hands against her stomach, feeling the faint kick of the child within her. Outside, thunder echoed like footsteps approaching from a distance. She whispered a prayer, not for herself, not even for forgiveness, but for silence, for just a little more time before the truth tore everything apart. Downstairs, Samuel cleared the table in silence. A single drop of rain slipped through the window frame, falling onto the wood beside him. He wiped it away, though the mark remained, dark and unyielding. He looked toward the stairs where she had gone, then back to the master's laughter echoing through the hall. His expression did not change, but in his chest, a truth he could no longer contain began to beat harder, heavier, louder than the storm outside. The storm came in the middle of the night, sudden and violent, tearing across the land as if the sky itself could no longer bear its silence. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters, sweeping the scent of wet earth into the Whitmore house. Evelyn woke with pain sharp and deep, a pain that spread through her body like fire. The sound of thunder swallowed her cry, and when it faded, another followed. The servants stirred in their quarters, uncertain if what they heard was the storm or something else. Then came the bell, one frantic ring, then another, and they knew. The doctor could not be reached. The roads were flooded, the bridges washed out by rain. There was no time to wait. The women of the house moved quickly, their faces pale beneath the flickering candlelight. Sheets were boiled, water carried, and the air thickened with urgency. Evelyn's voice broke through the thunder, low at first, then rising, raw with fear. The midwife took her hand, whispering comfort she didn't believe. The mistress's body trembled beneath the weight of each contraction. Outside, lightning split the sky, throwing wild shadows across the walls. Samuel was called to bring more water. He hesitated at the door, unsure if he should enter. When he did, the sight before him hollowed his chest. Evelyn's face glistened with sweat, her hair clinging to her skin. She looked at him once, just once, and that look carried everything they had never said. He turned away quickly, his hands shaking as he poured the water into the basin. The midwife caught the exchange, her eyes narrowing, her mind already beginning to understand. The hours stretched, the storm showing no mercy. The candles burned low, the air heavy with heat and fear. Then came the sound that silenced them all, the thin, piercing cry of a newborn child. For a moment, time stopped. The rain eased, as though the sky itself leaned in to listen. The midwife lifted the baby into the candlelight, her hands trembling. What she saw turned her breath to stone. The child's skin was light, but not pale. Its hair dark, its eyes wide and deep. The features that marked it could not be mistaken. Evelyn reached out, her voice barely a whisper, begging to hold her child. The midwife hesitated, torn between duty and horror. Around her, the women shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the door. The truth was there in front of them, alive, crying, undeniable. Evelyn clutched the baby against her chest, tears streaming down her face. She pressed her lips to its forehead, whispering words too soft to hear. Her voice cracked as she begged them not to speak, not to tell, not to let the world outside that room destroy what she held. But the truth does not need a voice to be heard. It breathes on its own. The door burst open. Whitmore stood in the doorway, his face half lit by lightning, his clothes soaked from the rain. He looked first at his wife, then at the child in her arms. For a heartbeat, he could not move. His breath caught, his body rigid. The sound of the storm filled the silence between them. Then his eyes focused, and everything within him turned to rage. No one spoke. No one dared. Evelyn tried to hide the baby's face, but it was too late. The master's voice broke through the room, not loud but cold, a sound that made even the wind falter. He stepped closer, staring at the child that bore another man's blood. The veins in his neck pulsed, his jaw tightening with every breath. The women lowered their heads, trembling. The midwife took a step back, clutching her apron, her lips trembling with words she could not say. Evelyn tried to reach for him, her voice shaking, her tears falling fast. She begged him to understand, to forgive, to listen, but forgiveness had no place left in that house. Whitmore turned his gaze to Samuel, who stood at the edge of the room, his clothes wet, his face pale. Their eyes met, and in that brief, charged silence, everything that had been hidden came to light. The storm raged outside, but inside the room, another kind of storm had already begun, one that would not pass with morning. Evelyn's sobs filled the space where words could no longer live. The child cried softly in her arms, its voice fragile and pure, unaware of the world it had been born into. Whitmore's shadow stretched across the room, dark and unrelenting, and the sound of thunder rolled once more, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what they had just witnessed. The night after the birth hung heavy over the plantation, as though the air itself refused to move. The cries of the newborn had long faded, swallowed by silence. Every servant walked with their eyes to the ground, speaking only in whispers, afraid that even their breath might carry the wrong sound. In the master's house, a storm far colder than rain had settled. Whitmore had not slept. He sat alone in his study, the glow of a single lamp cutting across his face, the decanter half empty beside him. His hands trembled, not from drink, but from the weight of what his pride could not bear. At dawn, the sound of boots echoed through the courtyard. The slaves had gathered, their faces pale in the morning mist. They didn't need to ask what was happening, they knew. 2 guards dragged Samuel forward, his wrists bound, his shirt torn from the night before. He did not resist. There was no point. His eyes were swollen, yet calm, fixed somewhere beyond the pain, beyond the fear. Whitmore stood waiting, his jaw set, his voice steady but hollow. He did not ask questions. He did not want answers. The truth had already scorched him. The first blow landed without warning. The sound was sickening, flesh meeting rage. Evelyn heard it from her room, a sound she would never forget. She rushed toward it, barefoot, her nightgown trailing behind her, crying his name, begging them to stop. But Whitmore's eyes were wild, his hand relentless. Each strike was not just punishment, it was desperation, an attempt to erase what could never be undone. When Evelyn reached the courtyard, she threw herself between them, shielding Samuel with her own body. Her voice broke into the air, torn and raw, her hands trembling as she clung to him. "Please," she cried, "please, I beg you." He did not force me. The words silenced everyone. For a long moment, even Whitmore froze. She had said it aloud. The secret that had destroyed them now lay bare in the morning light. Whitmore's face changed, not softer, not merciful, but colder. He stepped closer, his voice low, his words measured. "Was it love," he asked, "or was it lust?" Evelyn met his gaze, her breath shaking, her lips pale. "It was loneliness," she whispered. The word seemed to wound him more deeply than any betrayal could. He turned away, his eyes glistening, his hands trembling at his sides. He gave his orders quietly, almost gently. "Take the child," he said. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Evelyn, who shook her head in disbelief. "No," she gasped, clutching at the air as if she could hold her baby through sheer will. "No, please." Her voice grew frantic, each plea sharper than the last. "Don't take my child." But the footsteps came anyway, the sound of the door opening, the cry of the baby carried away down the hall. Whitmore did not look back. "Tell her," he said to the nurse, "that the child did not survive." Evelyn fell to the floor, her scream tearing through the house, a sound that seemed to stop time itself. Every corner of the estate heard it. It wasn't the cry of a woman, it was the cry of something beyond human, something broken too deeply to mend. Samuel was dragged toward the shed, his body limp, his breath shallow. Blood streaked his face, his voice barely more than a whisper. Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm for the last time. He turned his head slightly, his words faint but clear. "He has your eyes," he said. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark. Inside the house, Evelyn sat in silence, her hands stained with earth and tears. The world outside continued as it always had, the fields, the overseers, the sound of chains. But something within her had shifted forever. The lie her husband told would be repeated until it became the truth. The baby's cry would fade from memory, the name never spoken. Yet somewhere deep inside her, the sound of Samuel's whisper lingered, soft, fragile, and eternal. The days that followed carried no light. The house that once echoed with command and control now whispered like a tomb. Evelyn moved through it like a ghost, her footsteps slow, her eyes hollow. She spoke to no one, ate little, slept even less. The room seemed colder, the air heavier. Every night she woke to the same sound, a faint cry, distant yet near, the cry of a baby that was no longer there. At first, she told herself it was memory, but soon she could feel it, the presence, soft and lingering, somewhere in the dark. Whitmore had taken to drinking, the clink of glass against wood now the only rhythm that broke the silence. His once commanding voice had grown slurred, his temper unpredictable. He no longer walked the fields. The overseers whispered that he had started talking to things that weren't there, sitting in his study, muttering into the shadows, calling out names long buried. Sometimes he called for Evelyn. Other nights, they said, he called for Samuel. Outside, the land began to rot. The crops withered, no matter how much rain fell. The soil turned black and sour, the tools rusted faster than they should. The workers started to leave, one by one. Some ran in the night, saying the fields were cursed, that they heard chains rattling when the wind blew, that the sound of a crying child echoed across the cotton rows after dusk. The ones who stayed kept their heads down, afraid to look the mistress in the eye. Evelyn spent her hours in the nursery that had never been used. The cradle remained untouched, covered in dust, the blanket she had sewn months ago folded neatly inside. Each day she sat by it, her fingers tracing the edges of the fabric, her breath trembling with memory. That small blanket, soft, faded, embroidered with the letter W, was all she had left of what had been taken. She kept it hidden in the drawer of her nightstand, taking it out only when she was alone. Sometimes she pressed it to her chest, whispering lullabies into the silence until her voice broke. There were moments when she thought she saw him, Samuel, standing by the window, just at the edge of her vision. His face calm, his eyes full of something she could not name. And in those moments, she felt both comfort and terror. The scent of the rain reminded her of him, the sound of thunder too. Each night, she would light a candle and place it on the windowsill, facing the slave quarters that now stood empty. She did not know if it was prayer or punishment. Whitmore's mind began to unravel. He locked himself in the study, the shutters closed even at midday. Servants whispered that he had started tearing through the family Bible, searching for verses about sin and blood, muttering that his house had been defiled. Once, in the middle of the night, he staggered into the courtyard, shouting that he could see Samuel standing beneath the tree where he had been beaten. The guards found no one there, but in the morning, the ground beneath that tree was wet though there had been no rain. By the time autumn came, the plantation was nearly deserted. The townspeople avoided the road that led to the Whitmore estate, claiming strange lights flickered in the windows after midnight, and that a woman's voice could be heard calling out a child's name again and again. The preacher who once blessed the land now refused to set foot near it. They are cursed, people said, the Whitmores brought something upon themselves that God himself won't forgive. Inside the great house, Evelyn sat alone in her room, the candle burning low, the baby's blanket held against her heart. Her eyes were distant, her lips moving in a whisper no one could hear. The house groaned in the wind, the rafters creaking like old bones. Somewhere far off, a door slammed by itself. And in that moment, she thought she heard it again, the soft, gentle coo of an infant, followed by the sound of footsteps behind her. Slow. Familiar. Heavy. She turned, her breath catching, but the room was empty. Still, the candle flickered as though someone had just passed by. The years passed, and the land forgot its masters. The Whitmore plantation stood empty, its windows broken, its walls swallowed by ivy and silence. Time had erased the laughter, the orders, the prayers, and the screams, all that remained was the whisper of what once was. The town nearby spoke of it in hushed tones, saying that no one who stepped beyond its gates ever stayed long. Some claimed to see candlelight flickering through the upstairs window, others said they heard a woman's voice singing softly to a child no one could see. But the truth of what happened there had long been buried, or so they thought. One gray afternoon, many years later, a stranger came down the overgrown path. The wind caught at his coat, carrying the scent of rain and memory. He was young, maybe 20, his skin a soft bronze, his eyes light but deep, carrying the kind of sadness that doesn't come from his own life, but from the echo of someone else's. In his hand, wrapped carefully in old cloth, was something small. He reached the gates that leaned half open, their iron rusted and twisted with vines. The earth crunched beneath his boots as he stepped inside. The house loomed before him, silent and hollow, its doors open to the wind. He walked through the ruins, the shattered mirrors, the rotting staircase, the empty cradle in the corner of a dust-covered room. The walls seemed to breathe, the air thick with ghosts that didn't need form to be felt. Outside, in the far corner of the estate, stood a single grave, its stone cracked, the name almost faded by rain and time. Evelyn Whitmore, beloved wife and mother. The young man knelt before it. His hand trembled as he unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small, faded baby blanket, the threadbare edges still marked with the faint letter W. He brushed the dirt from the stone, his voice breaking into the quiet. "Mother," he whispered. The wind stirred the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, though no one had lived there for decades. The leaves rustled as if the house itself sighed in recognition. The candlelight that had haunted the upstairs window for generations flickered once more, a soft, trembling glow that lingered just long enough to be seen. Then it was gone. The young man stood, looking at the ruins one last time. The story of his bloodline, one of silence, sorrow, and love forbidden, had come full circle. He turned away, leaving the blanket where it belonged, letting it rest over the grave like a final peace offering between the living and the dead. The sky darkened, the rain began to fall, and the land seemed to breathe again, not healed, but quieter. The Whitmore name would fade into legend, the truth buried beneath whispers and superstition. But every few generations, when someone passes the old road at night, they still say they see her. A pale figure in white, standing by the window, holding something small against her heart, waiting for the child she lost and the forgiveness she never received. And somewhere, her story continues, not as history written by victors, but as a haunting that refuses to be forgotten. If you've made it this far into the story, remember, every silence carries a voice, and every past leaves a shadow. If you felt this story, if it stayed with you, take a moment, subscribe, like, and share this video so others can hear the story of Evelyn Whitmore and the child who carried the truth of two worlds. Comment below where you're watching from, and tell us what you think truly became of the Whitmore estate. Your engagement keeps these forgotten stories alive, because some histories deserve to be heard again.